Welcome to this edition of Innovative Conversations. This is a process we started several years ago at the Center for Innovative Practices and have continued to focus this year particularly on conversations related to the developing Ohio system of care for kids and their families. We think that these are topics of interest to a wide range of audience, both providers, family members, folks who are interested in how Ohio's system is developing. And I would argue that in the last couple of years, there's been some pretty significant developments, which we're going to jump into and talk about. These conversations are sponsored in part by the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services and the Begun Center at Case Western Reserve University. Like I said, today's conversation will focus on a really critical community-based intervention called intensive home-based treatment. We'll probably refer to mostly during this conversation to it as IHBT. And IHBT is a service that has a long and positive history and has taken on, I think safe to say in the last couple of years, kind of a new life. And actually in the last year, particularly, which again we'll talk about. So here to guide us through this conversation, I have two great guests who know all things about IHBT and about Ohio's system of care. So I have Heather Distin, and Heather is the project director at the Child and Adolescent Behavioral Health Center of Excellence and the Center for Innovative Practices, which is at the Begun Center for Violence Prevention, Education, and Research. We also have Richard Shepler, Rick, who is the director, co-director, I'm not always sure, Rick, where that lands, of the Center for Innovative Practices and the Child and Adolescent Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, also at the Begun Center, which is part of the Jack Joseph and Mort Mandel School of Social Sciences at Case Western Reserve University. So there we go. That's all the time we have. Thank you for being here. And we'll try to get this conversation rolling. So maybe it would be helpful to start out with a kind of a brief description of what intensive home-based treatment is today, IHBT. And kind of why we're talking about it.
Sure, I'll take that question. First of all, thank you for having us, Patrick, and want to acknowledge you as our founding director of CIP. And, intensive home-based treatment is something very, very near and dear to my heart. Mm-hmm. And people don't know this, but this is one of the things that Patrick and I, even though we didn't know each other back then, made our first initial kind of link when I believe, Patrick, you were the bureau chief for the kids department at Department of the then Mental Health, ODMH. And you guys were putting out some block grant money as it relates to kind of innovative services, in particular intensive in-home services. I think we called them home-based services back then.
I think so too.
And in Northeast Ohio, we were one of the first kind of regions that started implementing intensive home-based treatment. So the history is long and quite rich. Implementing the service in Ohio, refining it over time, all the way until today's implementation in Ohio Rise. So intensive home-based treatment, as we know it, is a service delivery model and also an approach available to youth with serious emotional disabilities and their families. And it's an approach, a service delivery approach, if you will, to helping families in their homes, youth in their communities and their schools, It's a very flexible service that's delivered, multiple times per week. That's where some of the intensity comes, but it's also how long the sessions last, because the sessions last as long as it takes, when we go out. It's not like a 50-minute outpatient session where at the end of a certain time, you're saying your time is up. You have time to finish the work that you're doing. The professionals have very small caseloads, ranging from anywhere to 3 to 6 families at a time. And the service is fairly brief, ranging from 3 to 6 months on average. In Ohio, we've done some looking at that, and it's been around 4.5 months on average. Over time, maybe inching toward 5 months. So it's intensive. It's a comprehensive mental health service. So we practice up and down the continuum of mental health services. We provide individual therapy, family therapy, crisis intervention, de-escalation, safety planning. Traditionally, intensive home-based treatment also did coordination of services and case management-like services, skill building. So you can see there's an array of services that are delivered by either one person or a team of professionals, right, going into the home intensively. And it really builds upon a very strong relationship with the family. And we really think of this as a different kind of a relationship, where we enter the home as a guest of the family in their home. We enter as a student of the family's culture and values, and as a professional, there to deliver a service. And when we enter in that way, it creates like I said, a different kind of a relationship than the families sometimes had in the past. Many of the families that we work with might have had difficult relationships at times with the systems that are trying to help. So it's not uncommon for our families or our kiddos to be involved with the juvenile justice system or children's services, right? Or maybe have an IEP at the school. And it's not uncommon then, when those relationships are there, that the family might feel like there's a lot of mandates in their life. And what we want to do is come in and help the family navigate the system. We want to help the family understand better about how the mandates affect them, but also how the youth can start to get better and the family can start to get better and have different relationships with the system itself.
So from the description, it's clearly a model, an approach that is both kind of global in its support of the family, but also strategic in terms of its specific interventions that may be needed for the particular youth, which is what I'm assuming brought the youth and the family to the attention of the system.
Yeah, so when we think about how youth are referred to the service, eligibility usually includes, some serious emotional or behavioral set of concerns that are identified. The youth sometimes is at risk of placement because of those. They might be returning from a placement. Traditionally, we think of that as residential treatment.
Right.
Or there could be a concern for their safety. And if we don't stabilize the youth at this time, that could lead to the youth having to go to a more restrictive treatment setting. So this is really a critical service in a system of care for kids, because what it's designed to do is to help stabilize the youth in their home, in their community, and to prevent that next step, which is a more restrictive option.
Right.
And we've been very successful over the years in doing that. Our success rates in keeping kids in the home at the end of treatment usually is anywhere from 85 to 95% of the time. We're able to keep kids in their home and community. So when the service is available, communities seem to value it quite a bit.
Okay, so that is a critical phrase there, when available, which I think we're going to be able to talk about in a little while when we start talking about some of the recent activity around the development and implementation of IHBT. So you talk about IHBT as being a point maybe on a continuum, and I know the continuum is probably more circular than it is linear. So where do you conceptually place that? And is it something that can move up and down, if that's the right term, on the continuum, depending on the youth and families' needs?
The way that I see it, it could be circular, but I think I see three main services that are main components, or services and processes that are main components of a mature system of care. And one of them is, high fidelity wraparound, that planning process that helps really bring the child and family team together to create a strength-based plan that includes services and supports. I think another service that's critical in any mature system of care is some kind of mobile response, crisis response service. In Ohio, we're using MRSS as one of those services, mobile response stabilization service. And I think the third leg of that stool is intensive home-based treatment.
Okay.
And I want to be clear that those are the three of the core services that keep kids in the community. But there are many other services, number one. And there are more restrictive services that are critically important when kids can't be maintained safely in the home, like psychiatric residential treatment facilities, PRTF, which is new to Ohio over the last, this year. So a complete system of care has both the right amount of community-based services that can treat kids in the community, along with services, if they're needed, that are more restrictive, but designed to keep the child safe while giving that child the treatment that they need.
Okay.
I think the other part of the system that I think is so important, that I think that Heather and I have witnessed and felt over the years, is that it's just not the services, it's also the supports that are there. So it's not uncommon for families, when they come to a child family team wraparound meeting, to request respite, pro-social activities, mentors, those positive experiences that quote unquote typical kids might be able to access, but our kids struggle to utilize for various reasons.
So IHBT has recently, in Ohio, gotten a boost, if you will, with the implementation of Ohio Rise, which is the Department of Medicaid's plan for kids with serious and complex behavioral and mental health conditions. Can you say, either one of you, just a little bit about Ohio Rise? We don't need to go into detail, but just in terms of the context, because I think what we're going to talk about next, is linked to that. So maybe just a brief description of how IHBT is related to Ohio Rise, or a little definition of what Ohio Rise is and intended to do?
So as you mentioned, Patrick, Ohio Rise is the Ohio Department of Medicaid's special managed care program for youth with complex behavioral health needs. And, Ohio Rise offers 3 tiers of care coordination, as well as a specialty benefit package of select services that really are well aligned to youth with complex behavioral health needs. Those services are things like behavioral health respite is a new item in the benefit package as part of Ohio Rise. The psychiatric residential treatment, PRTF, as Rick mentioned. There is flex funding is another new part of that Ohio Rise specialty benefit package. And IHBT was also put within the Ohio Rise benefit package. And so young people in Ohio that meet eligibility for that program have access to the full, behavioral health continuum, as well as those specialized services that we know are aligned for or developed for the target population that they serve. And Ohio Rise, one of the cornerstones of that program is access to wraparound and wraparound informed care coordination, depending on the tier of care coordination that you are found eligible for. And so IHBT fits within that, as many of the young people served would benefit from intensive home-based treatment models.
So recently, when I referred to the boost, was the opportunity that's actually still unfolding as we talk, the opportunity to increase the access to IHBT across the state. Can you talk, Heather, just a little bit about that process, what the expectation was, what the funding portfolio looks like?
Yeah. So, I think one of, as Ohio Rise sort of was set out from a visionary perspective of really bringing regardless of geography, where you live in Ohio, having access to the necessary services that your young person and family needs. And IHBT is one of those that, we have had for some time, geographically disparate sort of allocation of access to IHBT. And, there were upwards of, over 30 counties more, I think, that didn't have access to any form of intensive home-based treatment. And so the Ohio Department of Medicaid authorized $10 million to support the development of, but also expansion of access to intensive home-based treatment programming across the state to really bring a statewide-ness to intensive home-based. When you think about having access to the Ohio Rise program across the entire state and that foundational wraparound approach and that planning process, in order for all of that to come together, you need access to complementary and necessary, core services.
Right.
And so, the funding had some prioritization. So there was an RFA process where an RFA was announced, and the applicants had a prioritization for service deserts. And the funds were eligible to be used for not only supporting the program and organizational implementation startup phase of developing a new IHBT program or expanding access to a currently operational program, but funds are also able to be used to provide creative workforce strategies specific to recruitment and retention. So one of the biggest struggles we have had over the last several years in Ohio as it relates to intensive home-based treatment is workforce.
Yep.
And so these funds were really able to support the typically expected startup costs that go into implementing a new evidence-informed, evidence-based practice, but also to really target some specific workforce recruitment and retention that we know is critical right now in trying to really encourage and incentivize our behavioral health workforce to work in these necessary community, intensive community-based programs.
The thing that strikes me about it is, given our long history of innovative practices and attempting to move those forward in the state, the idea of supporting implementation features, I think, is fairly new development. I mean, pretty typically and pretty historically, you applied for a grant to develop or implement a program, and essentially you were, awarded the funds to hire the staff and, do the training. But that was kind of it. Then you kind of had to make it, fly and sustain itself. So this focus on recruitment, retention, other factors that help the implementation portion move forward, I think is a pretty unique factor. At least that's my impression. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that's my sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've seen some creative strategies in the human resources side of implementation, how we recruit and onboard and then retain staff in one of the most rewarding, but also can be challenging programs, intensive home-based treatment. And so in some of our other past but recent similar opportunities where we were able to issue RF grant awards to providers to get creative around implementing evidence-based and evidence-informed home-based programs, what we learned is that a lot of strategic attention was needed at the front door of onboarding. So it wasn't business as usual recruitment, but a lot of intentionally designed job postings with, recruiters that worked just for home-based programs. That's new, right? Typically, your organization has a human resources staff and they recruit for the full organization. And we had organizations playing with the idea of a recruiter that just recruits for community-based IHBT, these most intensive programs, because the strategy is different, right? You need to have licensed staff, unless you're doing a Teams model, but you've also got to really have the right recruitment strategy, who you're outreaching to, sending the mass email to the social work list, right? That we all get those emails. That hasn't been an effective strategy for this specific program. So encouraging organizations to really get creative and play with new ideas to recruit and retain staff and have some funding to support that innovative, creativity was built into this opportunity.
And I want to talk a little bit about, have you all talk a little bit about the results of that flexibility. But Rick, I wanted to kind of back up just a little bit, because it's my understanding that, and you've talked about it this way, IHBT as a model, which implies that it might look slightly or somewhat different given the provider and given what they applied for. That it is not a one size fits all necessarily, although it has to share basic and core features of that. So what was the experience of the response in terms of the variations in model, should I say?
Sure. So, Patrick, when we were in the trenches together and thinking about working, when we were working with the then Department of Mental Health, we were thinking about what's the best way to move forward on creating rules and things like this for these kind of services. And one of the options on the table was to pick specific models and then build rules around those models. But really the vision that you and I had was something different, which was, create this category of a service called intensive home-based treatment, right? It's a service delivery model. And within it, you could have different treatment approaches that you could insert into the service delivery model, right? So just like outpatient counseling, you can use different approaches. In terms of theories and theoretical approaches.
Right.
It's the same thing with intensive home-based treatment. So again, those core components, intensity, frequency, ability to practice up and down, being on call to the family 24/7, etc. And I mentioned, family therapy. I mentioned individual therapy. Well, there's all kinds of models of family therapy out there. And then there's all kinds of models of doing individual work or trauma work. So
Well,
what
I think one of the keys, one of the keys I think is that the definition, if you will, of IHBT is embedded. I mean, it's not up for wide interpretation. I mean, people may have kind of their, variation, but we have specific language of if you're going to do it, it's got to fit at least this box.
Yeah, I was interestingly preparing for this, and I was rereading Beth Struhl's original monograph from 1988 on home-based services, what she called it back then. It was the first service that they wrote a monograph on after putting out the system of care framework. Interestingly enough. It had many of the same, almost identical components. Nothing much has changed.
Yeah.
The service delivery model, that approach has remained very stable. I always ask people, what is it that you want to purchase when you're delivering, when you're trying to maintain kids in a less restrictive environment, when there's some safety issues and things like that? Well, you want to purchase intensity. You want to purchase both individual and family therapy. You want to purchase safety, being on call, being able to manage complex, and delivered in it frequently where the family lives. That's what I want to purchase.
Right.
Now, the theoretical modality that I utilize to implement it can be diverse, and that's kind of neat and exciting. And really it played out in the RFA that we put out for the $10 million, and we received many different models coming forward. And as long as they fit within the service delivery approach, in other words, what do we want to purchase? That intensity, that safety, that on call. It was not a problem to just say, hey, let's go try some of that and approve those.
Well, I should say that our listeners might want to check out the library of our innovative conversations, because I believe one of the first we did was with Beth. So we have that available to people.
Oh my gosh.
On the webpage. And we're talking about, it's been a little while since we did it, but I'm going to guess that 90% of it, holds up over the years, just as the monograph has held up over the years. So let's talk about a little bit about, so what were the results of the RFA? What happened as a result of $10 million being available across the state of Ohio?
So, the results were overwhelmingly positive. And it really demonstrates, the results of putting out an RFA for $10 million really demonstrated Ohio provider commitment to jump in and try something new to support this very specific high need population. So we received 39 applications that actually had a request total over $18 million. And so, the scoring group had quite a task in front of them with a lot of interest. But ultimately, 24 awards have been made to behavioral health provider organizations that are certified by the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services to develop and implement IHBT. Models that were awarded to your previous conversation included our traditional high fidelity intensive home-based treatment program, multi-systemic therapy, so an MST program, and then several IHBT, IFAST models were also included in the award. And so what's really exciting to think about is that these 24 awards are going to provide brand new service to 32 counties that are currently considered service deserts.
Oh, and that was going to be my question, is how you defined, I think I know, but can you just give us a sentence on how you all think about or defined service desert, which I think is really descriptive.
In the most simple way, to be honest with you, Patrick, a service desert in this RFA was if your county currently does not have access to an IHBT type of program, right?
Because some are multi-county providers.
Correct. Yes. So we are looking at if that multi-county provider had proposed to serve a county that was considered a service desert, didn't have access today. So through this opportunity, 32 counties that currently do not have access to this very important critical service are now going to have access to IHBT once the teams are operational. But the 24 awards also are going to bring expanded access to 26 counties that have IHBT, but the community need exceeds what the current programs can offer. And so this means when you think sort of scan out globally, that 76 counties in Ohio are going to have access to a type of IHBT. So that only leaves us with 12 counties that currently will remain as what's considered an IHBT service desert. And when we were making awards, we're really intentional about ensuring that the teams, those 12 counties that are still considered service deserts are surrounded by programs that once operational could expand into and have sort of those providers have the appetite for future expansion once they're operational in the community that they propose to serve. So it was, really an exciting, as we sort of are getting ready to really operationalize these teams, it's exciting to think about when you think about having the service deserts that we had in Ohio and what this might look like a year from now. It's a pretty exciting time.
Very. I mean, the expansion of a particular service, I can't remember a time when there was this kind of
lots of synergy
in the state.
I think the other synergy is that once they're up and running, you also need, like you were saying earlier, Patrick, kind of the sustainability component to it. We are very, it's almost like the positive perfect storm before this expansion grant came out. The Department of Medicaid raised really all the Medicaid rates, but also, one of the benefits was to intensive home-based treatment, right? So that 15-minute billing unit went up 12%, the highest it's ever been. And at the same time, Aetna, Better Health of Ohio, developed a case, developed a case rate.
Ohio Rise, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Managed, yeah. So it's the Ohio Rise Managed Care. And to almost an agency, the agencies are saying to us, the programs are saying, wow, that's a game changer. The case rate was a game changer for all kinds of reasons.
Sure.
And so not only can we build it, I think we can now sustain it. It really will, though, depend on getting that workforce in the door, right? And so workforce still remains one of those tricky kinds of, variables, but, what we're finding, and thanks to, Jeff Spears, who's helping us with this, that he did some calculations on salaries, right, that folks are offering through these kinds of approaches. And there is, this kind of a sweet spot that if you start raising salaries to a certain amount, you start bringing in, candidates. The other thing that I just want to share while I'm thinking about it is we're also seeing programs value the rate in such a way that they're making a determination that I'm going to transition my outpatient staff just to do this. Okay, so agencies are now making decisions. We're finally making it financially attractive, in addition to being such a wonderful service, right? For youth and families.
So you both kind of alluded to this a little bit, but maybe you could say just a little bit more specifically about what you see as the kind of operational challenges at this point at the local level. And I don't know if you want to speak to the, role of your center. I mean, not only does this impact, folks locally in terms of the ways you just mentioned and others, but it also, I would think, increases your sense of stress and responsibility as the center of excellence, connected to this endeavor. So I don't know if you want to talk about a couple of challenges at different levels, but there certainly are.
I'll start and then I'll let Heather jump in.
Okay.
I think some of the challenges, I don't know that these are as much challenges. I think one of the beautiful things about having a center of excellence over the years, right? Because now we're going on 24 years. And it was the ability to build up over time the curriculum. Okay, so we have our own curriculum, fidelity tool and a fidelity process that's linked to certification. We are also putting out consultation to programs around just kind of the, at the youth and family level, how do we help? How do we best help? How do we figure out where the help needs to be delivered and how? And so from an infrastructure standpoint, I think we're very ready to meet that challenge of increase. I mean, when I think about 76 counties, I think if this was 5 years ago, I would have said, I don't know how we're going to do it. Today, I can say, oh yeah, this is going to be fun. This is going to be great. This is what we've been always asking for, which is, according to Patrick Kanary, how do you take something to scale? It's one thing just to have pieces and parts throughout the state, but how do you take it to scale? And I think the state's finally figured out a way to do that and then support it.
Because it is a big scale up. And actually, another commercial for our podcast is a few back in the library, not too long ago, maybe a year ago. We did a podcast with two national experts around the whole implementation science aspect to taking systems to kind of the next level. And not, and I'm using, air quotes, not just provider implementation, but how does the system support the changes that are inevitable when you do something at this scale. So yeah, it is exciting, and you're right. It's what we've been looking for, wanting, and so here's the opportunity to do that. Heather, do you have any other and challenges? And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in a way of growth and development, where some energy and focus and maybe a few surprises along the way might happen.
Yeah, I think the workforce is the biggest challenge to the new awards, but I also think that retaining the currently operational teams as well. So sometimes there's this when we're building all of it all at once, a lot of times the same staff who are interested in working community-based work in different programs. And so just making sure that we're really strategic and that all of the opportunity and funding opportunity and attention that we're giving to new developing and new expanding teams doesn't accidentally or in an unintended way pull from what we already developed successfully somewhere else. And so that balance, and we're so lucky that the funding opportunity that Medicaid made available did include dollars to retain currently operational staff with stay incentive funds, just like the new teams will have access to. So I think it's an example of what you and Rick were dialoguing about in terms of, sort of at the individual community level, we're, building workforce and hiring and onboarding and creating a team. But what are some statewide like policy funding structures that have to happen concurrently to support growth that doesn't accidentally, derail something that you already had, successfully accomplished. So I think that's something else that's exciting about this specific sort of, as Rick said, perfect positive storm, is that there has been a lot of strategic, intentional design about when we move this piece, we've got to make sure we move these other pieces along with it.
Well, and it's a great real world laboratory, if you will, to see how it does work. And I don't mean the service, I mean the implementation of do people come upon, kind of aha moments that really, can and should be shared, like we never thought we'd be able to do this, and this is how we were able to, make it happen. So having that kind of 10,000-foot view of all the moving parts, I think if we have this conversation a year from now, it'll be very interesting.
Yeah.
To see how that, and a year is, as we all know, a year is a short time in the life of something like this. But I think it's worthy of looking at how those things are developing. And I know you've got the capacity and the staff on hand to, to really monitor that. So
I'm going to add one challenge that we need to always be thinking about, which is managing the expectation.
Yes.
Because, it's great that we can say, and we've awarded, X amount of dollars for X amount of programs in X amount of counties. The proof will be how well did we do in the implementation phase? What about the workforce? Where did we struggle, et cetera, et cetera? And by we, I mean the whole state, and just trying to figure out how do we do some of the hiring and sustaining. But I want to be really careful because it's a great thing, but we don't know yet how it will play out. Like you said, a year from now. And so it doesn't mean immediate capacity. It doesn't mean immediate access.
Right.
It means we're growing it.
Yeah.
And it's going to take some time before we know how well we grew it.
Well,
You
yeah,
know?
I mean, there's a ramp, and we're entering what, close to year 2 of Ohio Rise, and that is still,
Developing and growing.
yeah, still developing, still on the onboarding process, and might be for a very long time, which is realistic for something that is such a significant change to how we do business. So, I don't think that people should be hesitant to talk about what it's going to take to do this and to do it well. And like you said, to have the grace and the patience, to help the growth.
Right, right.
So before we're going to wrap up. I know that we're at the top of our time. Any other kind of final comments around IHBT? And then I just want real quick to hear your thoughts about a couple of the other services that we mentioned, MRSS and PRTF, just kind of where those are, what the headlines might be around those two things. But anything else on IHBT before we leave that particular topic?
I want to emphasize one of the things that Heather brought up, because I think there's some confusion around. So we've got our intensive home-based treatment rule, right, which is really the service delivery model. I think, and as Heather brought up, this high fidelity intensive home-based treatment model is the model that we have painstakingly developed for the last 30 years in Ohio. That is its own treatment model. Okay. So we have our own treatment model in Ohio that fits within the IHBT rule, right? And so there's this confusion about when you mention one, are you saying both? And really, no. One is the rule, it's the service framework. The other is our treatment model that Ohio supervisors came together literally 30 years ago and started putting together what would the model look like if we had our druthers to make it really strong. And that included all kinds of things like making sure that we had a strong family therapy approach, but also an individual treatment approach, and all of those things. And from that has created our training curriculum, and tools that we use to implement in the model we train on in Ohio. So I wanted to clarify that.
That's an important question. Thanks for noting that.
And then I also wanted just to put out there that, there was an initial push back, when Beth Stroll came out with her monograph in '88 to do home-based treatment nationally. And we had a lot of programs in each of the states, began at that time. And because, how it got funded and some of the, these programs waxed and waned. I would say I give credit to Ohio for and Ohio providers in particular for sustaining programming in intensive home base for this entirety since 1988, 1986, actually, in Ohio. And recently, 3 years ago, we were really pushing, and our center was pushing for national standards on intensive home-based treatment. And so we went to the National Technical Assistance Center, said, we're doing this, would you like to join us? And they did. And together with the University of Maryland, University of Washington, we put together, Yale was involved with this with Dr. Woolston, the state of Massachusetts with Kelly English. We all came together and developed these practice standards that are now national standards that states can utilize that, in a sense, talk about the essentials of intensive home-based treatment. They're both program and practice, and they're available on our intensive home-based treatment Ohio website, IHBT Ohio.
That's, I think that really speaks to your comments earlier about how you can have a model and within that model still have a diversity and individuality, and that's not even a word, an individualized approach that can look different based on the community, based on the population that you're serving. So I think having those standards at that level can only be a good thing to help guide people and to kind of, if you will, put some guardrails on what this thing is that we call intensive home-based treatment or high fidelity home-based, treatment. I think that's always important to have some grounding in, what something is. So good to know. And part of what we do with these podcasts is that we post resources along with the podcast. So I would suggest that there are a couple of resources like that. I think, Heather, the maps that show the difference, the before and the classic before and after are really powerful and helpful. And I think there's probably a couple of other things we've talked about that I know you all have resources for, but maybe specifically attach them to this,
I think we should also do before and after when you and I had hair, Patrick.
Oh, when you said 24 years, I always blanch at that because I really, it escapes me how that happened in our lives, but there you have it. Do you both have enough time, like 2 more minutes, to talk a little bit about maybe particularly PRTF, since that I think is the newest kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say ready to go because I'm not sure where it is implementation wise.
Sure. So Ohio launched PRTF, Psychiatric Residential Treatment Facility. Their first PRTF opened November 7th, I believe, November 8th of 2023. We have 2 operational PRTFs in Ohio with several other PRTFs that are working with Aetna and all of the different licensing bodies to get through the licensing, contracting, and in some cases, the brick and mortar. So, some are providers who were accepted but are currently making renovations and working through those contracting processes. Others were proposing to build new facilities. So everyone's got a different timeline, but we do have 2 operational PRTFs, one in central Ohio and one in northeastern Ohio, currently serving young people.
So,
and as far as MRSS goes, Patrick, that's a service that began through a SAMHSA grant that we had through the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. So it was a grant, a SAMHSA grant to implement, I believe, 7 programs in 13 counties, something like that, or 14 counties as a pilot. And in that pilot, we developed the MRSS curriculum. We developed a fidelity tool, the first of its kind nationally, as well as a practice manual and a toolkit. All of those things are on our MRSS Ohio website. And from that, we needed the boost of Ohio Rise and a way to fund the service more intentionally, this new mobile response stabilization service. And so the Department of Medicaid developed a new rate for that, which really made it more possible for programs to be able to implement this. But, and here's the big but not entirely. We have to think about mobile response programming as a firehouse model. And if it's going to be available for the entire state, the question is, okay, how do we fund Medicaid kids? How do we fund the waiting for the call to come in, the downtime? And then how do we fund non-Medicaid kids? And so you can see that the cost of this thing is not small. whenever you're funding something like that. So,
Right.
you know, the state's put out some, you know, state dollars for that as well to help fund some of the non-Medicaid. And we're in the process right now. The state is looking at what kind of modifications do we need moving forward to get to statewide-ness in Ohio for MRSS.
Okay.
And that's in process, and I don't know that I can say much more about it.
Okay.
Other than that, I don't know, Heather, if you wanted to add anything. Okay.
Okay. So we'll add that to our conversation for next year.
Okay.
Where those services have developed an impact, and again, trying to think globally, systemically about how all of these interact and intersect. So I want to thank you both so much for a really great conversation, and also, you know, shout out to not only the two of you, but to your staff around the support, the training, the consultation, all of the things that go into making these heavy lifts maybe feel a little less heavy to communities who are relying on you. And I know you feel the responsibility of that and are facing that in the, you know, the most positive and creative way possible. So thanks for this conversation, and thanks for what you're doing. And we're going to stay in touch on these things as they continue to develop across our state and benefit the kids and families that we all care about. So
yeah, thank you, Patrick. And I really glad you brought up thanking all of our staff, because every one of them is essential
yes,
to making these projects work. So thank you.
And thanks for the opportunity to work in this format where we can kind of talk about things and have conversations about them, and the work that goes into doing these with, you know, with Matt and myself. It's a really great resource to have. So thank you both, and have a good rest of the day. And
Thank you.
we'll talk again soon, I'm sure.
Thank you,
Sounds
Patrick.
good.